everyone. This is Travis Wright, Program Manager on the System Center Engineering team. Welcome to another session of the Private Cloud webcast series. Today's topic is configuring Virtual Machine Manager. For those of you that are new to this series, the series webcasts have been recorded and are available for on-demand viewing. If you just do a Bing search for bare metal to private cloud, the top link that comes up there is a blog post that has links to where you can view those recorded webcasts as well as view the schedule for the upcoming webcasts. Let's go ahead and get started here. So just a quick recap on what we've done so far. We have deployed a number of clusters in our physical environment. So we've got a VM host cluster, we've got a file server cluster, a SQL Server cluster, and a virtual machine manager cluster. And we've deployed Virtual Machine Manager at this point, and now the next step is for us to use Virtual Machine Manager to configure our fabric and start to deploy out the System Center VMs. So in today's session, we will add the Virtual Machine Host cluster into the Virtual Machine Manager instance here, and then we'll create a host group, we'll create a virtual network, create a cloud, create a VM template, and then using that VM template, we will deploy all of the System Center VMs that we need to install all the rest of System Center. So with that, I first want to start out and just discuss some Virtual Machine Manager concepts so we're all on the same page about what these terms mean so that the demos make more sense as we get into those. So the first term is a host. A host is simply a server which hosts virtual machines. A host can be a member of a host cluster, in which case the hosts that are in that host cluster work together to host the virtual machines that are running on that cluster. And a host for Virtual Machine Manager purposes can be a Windows Server 2008 R2 server with Hyper-V, VMware ESX, or a Citrix Zen server. A host group is obviously a group of hosts, and you use a host group for the purpose of organizing things. So as you go into the Virtual Machine Manager UI, over time you may add tens or more even hosts into your Virtual Machine Manager UI, and you may want to organize those in a way that makes sense. And it's also a way to have settings be applied at more of a group level instead of managing individual hosts. And you can also use groups to scope permissions. Host groups can be hierarchical, so that's another great way to organize all the hosts that you have in your environment. Next is a cloud. And a cloud is a logical concept, and it groups together portions of your fabric. So things like a logical network, VIP profiles, storage, library content, capacity quotas, which is basically how much capacity is available on that cloud, and then you can divide that up amongst self-service users. And then capability profiles. And capability profile just basically says what type of hosts do we expect to run on this cloud. You can use a cloud as a deployment target, so you can say, take this VM and deploy it to that cloud, and Virtual Machine Manager will identify the best host within that cloud to run that virtual machine. A cloud can be a security boundary. It is a quota control mechanism, and it's an organizational construct. So you can use clouds to organize your virtual estate. So having a cloud be a boundary or a group of virtual machines that are running on certain hosts. And a cloud effectively represents a portion of the fabric that you have. So by taking the entire fabric that you have of all your hosts and all your logical networks and all your storage and that kind of thing, you can subdivide it up into a logical kind of unit of that fabric called a cloud. And the last concept is a virtual machine template, and this simply stores the settings for how to deploy a virtual machine, how much RAM should it have, how many CPUs should it have, what logical network should it connect to, what operating system is installed on it, and so on. And then you can use those virtual machine templates to deploy out virtual machines. And by using a template to deploy the virtual machine, you make sure that the virtual machine deployment is done in a consistent way. And it makes it a lot easier to deploy a VM based on a template rather than configuring each of these individual settings for each virtual machine that you're deploying. So with that, let's go straight into the demo of how to configure Virtual Machine Manager once you've got it up and running. So I'll share out my desktop now. I'll give it just a second here to get out to everybody. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that now. And we'll start out with adding a VM host cluster. And by adding a host cluster into Virtual Machine Manager, this is how you deploy the Virtual Machine Manager agents out to those host cluster servers in that cluster. So let's go ahead and start the video here. The first step I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new user account, and this will be an administrative account that I will then add as an administrator onto each of the host environment in my environment. So I just call this the VM host service account. Nothing unusual here, just creating a regular Active Directory account. Okay, so that's now created an Active Directory. Now I'm going to go to the first node in the cluster and add this account into the local administrators group, and do the same on the next node of the cluster here. Okay, so now that I've done that, we're going to go into the Virtual Machine Manager UI and just right-click on the host here and choose to add a host cluster. And we're going to just back up because it's going pretty fast. Okay, there we go. We're going to add Hyper-V hosts and clusters. That'll launch the wizard here. And here we can tell Virtual Machine Manager where we want to find these servers that we're going to add in. In this case, these host cluster nodes are added to the Contoso Active Directory domain, so I'd leave that with the default option there. On the next screen here, I'm going to create a new Run As account here. So I'm going to first browse for a Run As account. I'm going to create a new one, and this is going to be the Run As account that I just created in Active Directory. So this will be the VM host admin account here. So just add that in here. Now, what this does is this stores these credentials securely in Virtual Machine Manager so that they can be used to discover this computer and then deploy the agents to it. So now there, just on the previous screen, I just simply entered the name of the cluster. In this case, it's VM host plus, and okay, and now it goes out and it discovers that in fact this VM host plus is actually a cluster, and we've got those two physical nodes inside of that cluster. And so Virtual Machine Manager is smart enough to detect a cluster versus a distinct server. So we'll just check off that box there. So we want to add the entire cluster in here, and here it's asking me which host group I want to include this virtual machine host cluster in. At this point, I don't have any host groups created, so it's just going to add it to the all host group, and later we'll create a specific host group for it and add this host cluster to it. Okay, and then here we just click finish, and that kicks off a new job here, and you can see that it has now added the host cluster over here in the navigation pane underneath the all hosts group. So at this point, the Virtual Machine Manager agents are now deployed to both VM host A and B, and those agents are capable now of sending back discovery information about what's running on those hosts and the current status of them and so on, as well as taking jobs from Virtual Machine Manager to deploy new virtual machines or deprovision virtual machines and so on. Okay, so there's those two things. Now, the next step is to add a VM host group. This is the easiest task we'll do all day. You just right-click on a folder, say create host group, give it a name, and then you can drag and drop hosts and host clusters around from one host group to another. Okay. Now the next step is we're going to add a VMM library server. Now, VMM library server is where we're going to store, what we call library content. So this is things like ISO disk image files as well as virtual machine templates. We can also store VHDs there, we can store VMs there, and so on, so we can archive them there. So what I've done ahead of time here, we talked about this last week, is that I've created a file server cluster, just a standard Windows file server cluster, and I'm now going to configure that thing. So we start out with just going into here, and we're going to go to the administrators group, and we're going to add this service account that I've created ahead of time called the VMM library account. Okay. Now, I've also got a disk that I've presented from the SAN. So I've already brought that disk online, and I'm now going to add that to the cluster. So you can see here that disk has got a drive letter of L. And the next thing we're going to do is just go into the failover cluster manager here and right-click on storage and choose Add Disk. And that'll prompt us to select the disk. In this case, there's only this one additional disk that's a non-system, non-quorum drive, so that makes it easy. And once that disk is added, okay, now we're going to right-click on the cluster here, and we're going to say Add Storage. Check off that additional disk here. Once that's added in as storage, the next step here is to add a shared folder. So what we need to do is create a network share that Virtual Machine Manager can access. So we'll create a directory in the root of the L drive called VMM library. And I'm just going to change the permissions on this to make sure that the VMM library service account has access to this, as well as the VMM service account. Okay, so you can see that the VMM library account has full control on this, and the Scvmm service account also has full control. Okay, and then I'm going to make this available as an SMB file share with the name VMM library. You could change that if you wanted. And we're done. Okay, so once that's all done, that file share is now just available as a standard SMB file share off of that server. We're going to go into the Virtual Machine Manager UI now and right-click on Library Servers and say Add Library Server. Here we'll choose to use the VMM Live Service account as a Run As account. We'll type in the file server cluster name here. So I always want to connect to the cluster. And you'll see that it discovers the available shares that are on that cluster right now. So there's the VMM library share that we just created. We'll check that off and add this library server. You can see over here on the left in the navigation pane now, we have this VMM library folder. That's where we'll store library content. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going back and I'm going to create an additional share here where I'm going to store virtual machines. So I'm just going to go in here, I'm going to create a new share, just as we saw before, calling it stored VMs. And we'll do the same as we did before, changing the permissions to make sure that the VMM Live service account and the Scvmm service account both have access to this share. Now, technically, this isn't really necessary since both of those accounts are local admins, but I always do this as well, just in case somebody ever actually removes those accounts as local admins as well. So, all right, so this is just the same as we did before. Create. And now we'll go back to the Virtual Machine Manager UI, and we'll refresh this library server, and you'll see that it'll add in a new folder in here for us. Right. Our stored VMs, so we have another library folder there. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is create a virtual network. So a virtual network is just a logical representation of some portion of a physical network. So to do that, I'm just going to show you the properties of this here. So we just right-click on those properties, check off which virtual network this is going to be made available to, or sorry, which host group this is going to be made available to. So therefore, any hosts that are in this this host group should have access to this portion of the physical network that this logical network represents. And any virtual machine that we try to deploy to this to a host within this host group has to be able to deploy and hook up to this logical network. Okay, so here we'll identify the VLAN ID and the subnet here. Okay, so that's creating a virtual network. Next thing we're going to do is create a cloud. To create a cloud, we just click on this Create Cloud task up here in the toolbar, and we're just going to give our cloud a name. In this case, I'm going to call it Production. Check off which host groups are supporting this. Check off which logical networks are available. Check off any load balancers, bit profiles, storage classifications. And here we're going to add in the stored VMs folder. Okay, so this is the folder that if we're going to save a VM out of this cloud, then it's going to go into this folder right here. And then we're also going to add in read-only library share. So here we check off the library folder that we created earlier. Here, on that previous screen, we can configure the capacity quotas. Let's go back and just look at this real quick here. Okay, oh, dang it, this is too fast again. Anyway, the capacity quota is where you can configure how much RAM, how many CPUs, how many virtual machines, etc. can be deployed to this cloud, and that helps you constrain the amount of sort of virtualization that's happening on this particular cloud. And then when you go and grant access to the consumers of this cloud, you can scope that effectively such that they can only consume a certain part of the overall fabric by scoping the capacity of this cloud. And here on the capability profiles page, we're going to check off that we only expect Hyper-V servers to be run in this cloud. So we just check that off here. All right, and then finish, and we've now got our cloud created. Okay, now I'm going to stop here before we go on to the next section and see if there's any questions. Okay, I don't have any questions in the queue just yet, so I'll just keep going here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual machine template that we'll use to deploy all of the virtual machines that we need to run System Center on top of this host. So this first step that we're going to do is we're going to create a new virtual machine. So I right-click on the cloud there, and I choose Create Virtual Machine. And this will bring up the Create VM wizard, and here I've got a choice to either use an existing virtual machine as sort of a baseline to create it from, use a VM template, or a virtual hard disk. But in this case, I don't have any of those things yet, so I'm going to create a new virtual machine from a blank VHD. I'm going to give my virtual machine a name. In this case, I'll just call it something like Windows Server 2008 base or something. Alright, now we're going to configure the hardware for this virtual machine. So to start out with, I'm going to check off that this is a Hyper-V VM. I'm going to up the number of processors to 4, change the amount of memory to 4 gigs of RAM. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is remove this legacy network adapter. Oh, and I'm also going to add in the ISO file. So you may have noticed there that the ISO image file was, you can see right here in this path, that this ISO image file I've added to the VMM library. So I just went to this file share and copied a Windows Server ISO image file right here. And then I'm adding that in as a DVD drive to this virtual machine such that when it boots, it'll boot to this ISO image and we can install the operating system on it. Okay, and last I'll remove this legacy network adapter. You really only need that for booting to a network image. We're not doing that in this case, so I'm going to add in a regular network adapter, and I'm going to connect up this network to the virtual machine virtual network. Okay, so with that, I think we're all done here. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next step here, which is to select the destination. And in this case, we're going to say that we want to deploy it to a private cloud. And Virtual Machine Manager now looks at all of the hosts that are available within that private cloud and determines which host is the best candidate for deploying this virtual machine to. So in this case, both of these hosts don't have any virtual machines on them. They have the exact same hardware configuration and everything, so they're equally good candidates. So let's go ahead and choose the first one there, and we can change some options like what action to take when the virtualization server starts, and also what to do when it stops. Okay, those we just leave it the default. And now what I'm going to do here is just create this VM. And this will be provisioned now out on the VM host A node of the cluster. You can see that here. Once it's provisioned out there, I'm going to start it up, and then I'm going to connect to it. And you'll see that indeed it starts booting to the ISO file so that we can install Windows. I've cut out all of the Windows installation part. That's something I'm sure all of you have done many, many times. But the idea is that once you get Windows installed, then you come into here and you change whatever configuration settings you want to change. So typically, like, I'll enable remote desktop and set it up to automatically install updates from Windows Update and so on. Once you've got everything sort of configured the way that you want, you then shut down the virtual machine. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sysprep this virtual machine and make this available now as sort of a base virtual machine image template that we can use. Once this is refreshed, we can see that it's stopped now. And I'm going to right click on this existing virtual machine. I'm going to say create VM template. Okay, now it's going to prompt me here with this warning that says if you do this, it's going to destroy the actual virtual machine itself. Okay, and in this case that's fine because I explicitly created this virtual machine for the purpose of creating a VM template based on this with a sysprepped Windows Server image inside of it. So go ahead and click yes on that. And then it's going to ask me for the name for my template. Here I can change the virtual machine configuration if I want. In this particular case, I'm just going to leave it as is and leave everything else the same, right? So one thing I will change here, though, is I'll set it up so that it automatically sets the admin password for the local admin to a particular password. And there's some other options here that you could change as well, but we're not going to change those for now, other than also we're going to automatically join it to the domain. So we can do that by providing the domain name to join it to and provide the credentials for that. In this case, we'll go ahead and use a run as account so that that makes it nice and easy to administer. Now, so what's going to happen is every time we deploy a virtual machine based on this template, it's going to automatically add it to the domain using those run as credentials, and it will set the local admin account password to this well-known password. Now, the nice thing about this is that just saves us a lot of work. Every time we provision a new server, we don't have to go in and add it to the domain and change the password, do that sort of thing. Okay, now here it's asking us where we want to store this virtual machine template at. Okay, so we'll just store it in there, and we'll click go. And you can see that it's now sysprepping the virtual machine. And when it's done, it'll remove this machine out of the list of virtual machines because it's no longer going to be a virtual machine. And it'll now be available over in the library. So we select here on VMs. You can see that there is this new virtual hard disk here, and we'll have a VM template created based on that as well. And there's the new VM template. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a VM template. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to create a template from the template. So think of this as kind of like a template copy. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new virtual machine template that's designed not just as like a base operating system image, but one which is designed as kind of a base virtual machine template for deploying a system center server. And the only thing that's really different about this is that I'm going to bump up the amount of RAM that's available for these types of servers to use dynamic memory and anything in the range of 8 to 12 gigs. And then also going to remove the ISO image file because we no longer need that. Okay, and then we're also going to, here on the operating system page, we're just going to add some additional features that we know that most System Center server roles require, like the .NET Framework 3.5.1. So the nice thing about this is that every time a virtual machine gets deployed based upon this template, those features will be added automatically. So here I'm just scanning through the list to see if there's anything else we might want to add. You can do the same with Windows Server roles if you want to add in particular roles. And then here we can check off what operating system we have inside of this VM. And that's pretty much it. We don't need to configure SQL Server or anything like that. So now we have a new VM template we're going to use. Now we're going to deploy some new System Center virtual machines using that template. So to do that, we'll right-click on the template and say Deploy Virtual Machine. We'll give the virtual machine a name. And here we could change the hardware configuration, the operating system configuration, whatever. But for the purposes, we're just going to go ahead and move forward. I did give the server name a name of SMMS1. We're going to deploy it to a cloud. We'll choose VM host A again. And here you can see that we're going to give it a name of SMMS1. So this will be the Service Manager Management Server 1. Click Next. We'll leave all this at the default. And we're going to click Create. But actually, before that, let's take a look at this View Script button. So the View Script button is a really handy feature in Virtual Machine Manager, which allows you to take a look at the exact commands that the Virtual Machine Manager console is going to call using PowerShell. So to deploy this virtual machine, this is the sequence of PowerShell commandlets that are going to be run in order to deploy this virtual machine based on this template. And this is handy because what I can do is I can take this PowerShell and I can tweak it such that instead of it being specific for deploying this one virtual machine, I can set it up so that it's maybe more parameterized so that I can pass in some of the information I want to, like the server name. Because other than the server name, everything about all of the, 12 or so probably virtual machines I want to deploy in order to run System Center, they're all the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all this, I'm going to kind of tweak all the PowerShell here and create a reusable PowerShell script so that I can just pass in the name of the virtual machine I want to create. And that way I don't have to go through the wizard each time to do this. So we'll see that in action here in just a second. Okay, so we'll go back here and I'll click Create, and this will now provision out that virtual machine for us. Now, here's an example of the PowerShell script that I created. So apologies, the text is probably a little small. Because this was running inside of the virtual machine I no longer have access to, I can't really bump up the font size. But basically what it does is it has an input parameter to pass in the virtual machine name that I want to create. And then it calls get Scvmm template in order to get the template that we want to use. And it goes and looks for that system center _ base template. And then it creates a new Scvmm configuration based upon that template. We can get the cloud that we want to deploy it on by calling get sc cloud and passing in the name production. And then we call new sc virtual machine and we pass in the name of the virtual machine that we want to create, the configuration that we want to use, the cloud that we want to deploy it to, and just kind of other miscellaneous information here. But this is a very simple little PowerShell script, and I can then use it to deploy this thing. So you can see that the input parameter is VM name. That's used to create the name of the virtual machine as well as the name of the computer that's being deployed. And now if I go back to the VMM console and launch PowerShell, from there it'll load all the PowerShell modules for me, and then I can just new directory over to the place where I have the script saved. And I can call new vm.ps1 and pass in the name of the virtual machine I want. And just keep repeating that. So I do sp2, orc1, orc2, and DWMS, I think, are the computers that I used here in this example. So by doing that, it just makes it so much more efficient to deploy these virtual machines instead of going through the wizard each time to deploy them. And it also makes it very standardized because I just execute it the exact same way every time, and I don't have to worry about forgetting something as I go through the wizard. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how to set up and configure a virtual machine manager. There's obviously a lot of other settings and things that you can do to configure the fabric and set up user roles and add content into the library and so on. But this is sort of the basics of what you need to do to get a private cloud running and managed with Virtual Machine Manager. Okay. So I'm going to go through the questions now. I think the question is, does it have some sort of unattended installation? Yes. So let's see, unattended installation. So I guess you're asking about, yeah, so when you're deploying the operating system and you want to have an unattended installation, the way to do that is using Sysprep. So that was the purpose of why we Sysprepped this virtual machine, is so that we can then have a baseline image and then we can provision using that Sysprepped VM. And the Sysprepping takes care of doing this, of installing the operating system, that part of it, right? And then the rest of the things that you want to do are also covered by the VM configuration. So whatever you define in the template, such as which features to install, which roles to install, what the local admin password should be, what license key to use, etc. All of that can be configured as part of the VM template, such that when that VM is deployed, that all just happens automatically by a virtual machine manager. Okay, how do I associate a network with a virtual SW? Not really sure what you mean by virtual SW. Maybe you can clarify that question for me. I'll come back to it. For those of us that are doing this in a tiny lab POC, have they fixed the issue that iSCSI target cannot be managed from VMM? No, we don't have iSCSI added into VMM yet. I know that's been a big ask, and it's something that we'll look at for the future. But for now, that's not there. When VMM 2012 stores VM to library, does it remove the virtual NIC from VM if VM is stopped, like VMM 2008 R2 does? Sorry, I don't know the question on that one. I don't often store VMs to the library like that, so I don't know. All right, any other questions that people have? Okay, virtual switch is what you mean. Okay, how do I associate a network with a virtual switch? Okay, so that was the configuration we saw there, right? If you, in the VM template, when you configure that, you're identifying which. Hang on. You want to know how do I associate a virtual network with a virtual switch? So the way that works is that when you install Hyper-V and you set it up so that you've got a virtual switch in Hyper-V, then when you add the host cluster into Virtual Machine Manager, it discovers the virtual switches that are on those hosts, and then let's see, how do you associate the virtual network with that? That is done by That's a good question. I never really thought about that. It just sort of works. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that one either. Okay, can clouds be created, configured using PowerShell? Yes. as possible. It's kind of a beast though because it requires so many input parameters. Personally, I think it'd be a lot easier to use the wizard to do that, unless you had to create a whole lot of clouds. Pretty much, essentially anything you can do in the Virtual Machine Manager UI, you can do using PowerShell. So that's sort of a prerequisite for that, is that we try to do everything that we can do in the UI through PowerShell so that it can be scripted. Okay, no more questions in the queue here, so we'll give it just a second more. Okay, no more questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you very much for attending. Let me just go back to the slide deck here and we'll talk about kind of what's coming next. So today we finished configuring Virtual Machine Manager. We added in the file server cluster as a library for Virtual Machine Manager. We added in the host cluster into Virtual Machine Manager as a host. We added a host group and put that host cluster into that host group. We created some VM templates and pushed those out. So that's all sort of done. So at this point, we now have a stack of VMs that are running on this host cluster, which are sort of prepared at this point, for the most part, for us to deploy the System Center components on. So the next step for us is to deploy and configure Operations Manager. So the next session for the bare metal to private cloud series here will be installing and configuring Operations Manager, and that will be on June 19th. So we're going to skip next week because it's TechEd US and a lot of people are going to be attending that. And so we'll skip next week. We'll come back on Tuesday, June 19th, same time at 11 o'clock Pacific time for that next session. So thank you very much for attending, and you can see my contact information there. If you have any follow-up questions from the session today, please feel free to send me an email or shoot me a tweet on Twitter. Thank you all.